At first, Rush wasn't even sure there would be a tour. That detail changes everything about what happened when Anika Nilles first sat behind the drum kit with Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson. The idea of bringing Rush back after Neil Peart's death was emotionally complicated. Lee and Lifeson had spent years accepting that Rush's touring days were over. Then, in March 2025, they held their first intense rehearsal with Nilles, not as a guaranteed reunion, but as an experiment to find out whether this could actually work. Lee later admitted that if replacing Neil became too difficult, they were prepared to walk away from the entire idea. Cygnus X1, and that meant the rehearsal wasn't simply about learning songs, it was a test. Could Anika understand the strange musical language that Lee, Lifeson, and Peart had developed over decades? Could she honor Peart's parts without becoming a copy of him? And perhaps most importantly, could the three musicians actually feel like Rush again? Then something unexpected happened. The more they rehearsed, the more ambitious the plan became. What started as a cautious experiment eventually turned into the 50-something tour, and Lee and Lifeson began demanding more from themselves and from the new lineup. But there was one major problem waiting inside those rehearsals. Anika wasn't just learning Rush's songs, she was exposing how much of Rush's music had never been written down as simply as fans imagined. And that realization would force Geddy to rethink the plan. The biggest challenge wasn't simply speed. Neil Peart's drumming was built around details, accents, transitions, dynamics, and tiny rhythmic decisions that made Rush sound like Rush. So when Anika Nilles approached those parts, the goal couldn't realistically be to turn her into a human copy of Neil, and Geddy Lee understood that. During the rehearsal process, Nilles had to learn an enormous amount of material, while also finding a way to make the music feel natural in her own hands. Lee and Lifeson had to listen differently too. They weren't just checking whether every note was correct. They were discovering what the songs could sound like with a different drummer. That distinction became crucial. Nilles has spoken about the pressure of stepping into a catalog that was so closely associated with Peart, while also emphasizing that she wanted to bring her own musical personality to the performances. The band's approach ultimately became less about recreating the past perfectly, and more about making a new version of Rush work on stage. And that is where Geddy's change becomes interesting. The rehearsal process showed them that some arrangements could not simply be treated like museum pieces. If they wanted the songs to breathe with Nilles, certain moments needed to be approached differently. But there was another question hanging over everything. How much could Rush change without losing the identity fans came to hear? The answer would shape the entire tour, and the next rehearsal would reveal just how far Geddy and Alex were willing to go. The turning point came around the fourth day. Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson had already spent days working through Rush songs with Anika Nilles. Technically, she was impressive, but something still wasn't completely clicking. Lee later described the early sessions as a test. They weren't even sure Rush would tour again. Then, after several days of playing together, Lee and Lifeson privately compared notes, and that conversation exposed the real problem. Nilles could handle the difficult material, but Rush wasn't only about hitting the right notes. Neil Peart had built layers of feel and internal dynamics into his parts, and those details were essential to how Lee and Lifeson remembered the songs. So instead of simply telling Anika to play the parts harder or faster, they changed the conversation. They focused on feel. That distinction mattered. Nilles later explained that her first rehearsal was heavily focused on understanding Neil's musical approach and making the songs feel right for Lee and Lifeson, not simply reproducing every note mechanically. Yahoo! Then something remarkable happened. Once that missing piece started to click, the uncertainty began disappearing. By the fifth day, according to Lee and Lifeson, Nilles had reached the point where she was no longer simply demonstrating that she could play Rush songs. She was beginning to understand why those parts worked. And suddenly, the question changed from, can we do this, to something much bigger. How far can we actually take this? That shift would eventually turn a 5-day experiment into the foundation of Rush's return to the stage. But here's where the story gets even more surprising. Geddy's change of plan wasn't about replacing Anika, it was almost the opposite. After the fourth day of rehearsals, Geddy and Alex had seriously wondered whether they should continue with someone else. Technically, Nilles could handle the material. The problem was something much harder to teach, the feel inside Neil Peart's arrangements. Then, on the fifth and final day, everything changed. Nilles took their feedback and applied it immediately. Alex described it as her suddenly changing gears. Geddy later said that this was the moment the final tumbler clicked into place. The doubts they had been carrying simply disappeared. RushIsAband.com. And for Geddy, there was another sign that mattered enormously. The drummer-bassist connection was back. As they played, Geddy and Anika began making eye contact, the kind of musical communication Geddy had shared with Neil for decades. That wasn't something a technical audition could prove. They had to feel it in the room. Suddenly, the plan was no longer about finding out whether Anika could survive Rush songs. They were imagining what Rush could become with her. That was the real turning point. Because once Geddy and Alex realized they had found the chemistry they needed, there was only one thing left to do: commit. And that commitment would transform 5 days of uncertain rehearsals into one of the most unexpected comebacks in Rush history. So, did Geddy Lee really change the plan because Anika Nilles suddenly proved herself? The truth is more interesting. The original 5-day rehearsal was never supposed to guarantee a Rush reunion. Geddy and Alex Lifeson were genuinely prepared to stop if replacing Neil Peart felt too difficult. During the first 4 days, they weren't convinced. Something about the musical connection wasn't working, even though Nilles had the technical ability. Then came that final rehearsal. Nilles listened to their concerns about feel and about the way Peart's parts interacted with the rest of the band. She adjusted, and suddenly, everything clicked. That moment changed the entire equation. Instead of asking whether Rush could continue without Neil, Geddy and Alex could finally imagine what this new version of Rush might become. And they made their decision. Nilles wasn't being asked to replace Neil Peart. She was being asked to help Geddy and Alex bring the music back to life while respecting everything that came before. That decision eventually became the 50-something tour, Rush's first major return to the stage in more than a decade. And when the band finally stepped on stage in 2026, the experiment was no longer an experiment. It was Rush again, different, emotional, and impossible to separate from Neil's legacy, but still alive. And perhaps that was the real change Geddy made during those rehearsals. He stopped asking whether Rush could exist without Neil, and started asking what Rush could become next.